So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We're so happy to see all of you here today, especially for this festival centered around the ideas of social justice and progress, especially fitting for a day following our celebration of Martin Luther King Day, a day that since its inception has been associated with service and education. Dr. King challenges us with his very famous question, what he defined as life's most persistent and urgent question: what are we doing for others? Tonight, our answer is a simple one. We are gathering here together to educate ourselves and each other about social injustice. As Dr. King said, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically, which means, in part, as our USAO students here tonight know all too well, asking some really uncomfortable questions. We will have some uncomfortable questions tonight as we hear about social injustice in its several forms: overt social injustice, life-threatening injustices, legalistic injustices, and some injustices so subtle that we may not even have noticed that it exists. Our speakers tonight will ask us some very uncomfortable questions and challenge us to think along with them. Questions like, what happens when the promise of equal justice under the law, an American ideal that we hold so clearly and deeply that it is engraved on the highest court in our land, what happens when equal justice under the law is subverted because the very law itself is unjust? What happens when our media enshrines ideas about gender inequalities in something that many of us will be tempted to dismiss as completely unimportant: superheroes? What happens in a political situation so volatile that dissent can mean the same thing as death? Can something as seemingly simple as music help diffuse that situation and act as a call for social justice? We should worry about all of these questions: laws that are supposed to protect but maybe do not, entertainment that perpetuates social injustices, and political systems so severe that free speech can only happen if disguised as just music. So we have to learn about the injustices that surround us, the ones we know about but have conveniently forgotten to notice anymore, and the ones we've never heard about at all. And that's where we meet our first presenter of the evening, Dr. Lee Hester, Professor of Indian Studies here at USAO, who will offer us our first challenging question of the evening. Are the systems of criminal justice that overlay and intersect within U.S. and tribal jurisdictions actually creating social injustice? Dr. Hester?
Well, thank you very much. That was an incredible introduction, and I think that Dr. Long has ended up probably laying things out so well that I'm not sure that any of us are going to quite be able to live up to the introduction. So, as she said, I'm going to be talking about when criminal justice ends up becoming social justice, and specifically talking about it within Indian country. I am obviously most interested in Indian-related issues, and specifically my specialty really is Indian law and policy, so that's how I end up coming to this. Now, I thought I'd go ahead and start off with this visual to try to give us kind of a metaphor for a lot of different elements of what I end up wanting to talk about today. So when you see that picture, when you look at that picture, what kinds of things do you end up thinking about? Any ideas, folks? Is it kind of a positive picture? You see that shining light? Okay. The door is open, okay. And the thing is, does a person have an open door if they don't feel confident? No, okay. You have to have a certain amount of confidence to have an open door, right? Open doors. Open doors also mean possibilities, don't they? Right? That's an open door to a new future, to something new, to something different, right? Open doors say a lot of different things. But unfortunately, open doors aren't the reality for all people. About 10 years or so ago, a daughter of a very close friend of mine, who happens to be an elder of the Choctaw Nation, called me up, and she had been suffering from spousal abuse. And she called me to come over to her house to do that to her door, okay? I ended up helping her. I put it up. I used to be a carpenter before I became a philosopher. Everyone should have a day job, right, that they can fall back on. Carpentry is pretty good for philosophers, let me tell you. And she called me up because she knew that I could do this kind of thing for her. She was scared, okay? She was scared actually for her very life. That's the reality that a lot of women, and a lot of Indian women specifically, end up facing. And it's a horrible, sad reality. Now, just how big is this problem? Well, there's a 2008 CDC study that indicates that about 39% of Native women are identified as victims of intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. That's an incredible statistic, right? It's a terrible statistic. Now, there's all sorts of sociological reasons why that might be true. There's all sorts of reasons that are historical why that might be true. You can see that you can end up coming at this from a lot of different ways, and I guarantee you that every single one of these play into this. Now, of course, as a specialist in law and policy, I come at it largely from a law and policy way, okay? And this particular problem has been with us a long time. So the thing is that it's not a blip on the radar screen. This isn't something that is just happening recently. This is something that's a long-term issue and something that needs to be addressed. Now, clearly, it's partly a criminal justice issue, but it's affecting a particular group of people. It's kind of merging on into a social justice issue, and you'll see that it's even more of a social justice issue in a moment. The problem is actually even worse than that statistic indicates, as horrible as it is, right? Because it turns out that American Indian women seldom ever report abuse. And actually, among most populations, reporting abuse is very difficult, right? There's all sorts of reasons why it's difficult. In the case of spousal abuse, this is a person that presumably you at one time loved, right? It's very difficult to go ahead and come forward, very difficult to admit that you're in this kind of a relationship. You feel as if somehow you may be responsible. You're not, right? You're not. But you can have all of these conflicting feelings. So for any group, whether you're American Indian or not, it's very difficult to come forward, very difficult to seek justice. In the case of American Indian women, they firmly believe that if they do report it, that nothing will be done. And the problem is that their experience has really taught them that this is right. Now, trying to figure out why the experience is that way, that's kind of difficult, okay? So let's kind of go down this path. According to Justice Department statistics, at least 70% of violence in Indian country is perpetrated by non-Indian people against Indian people, okay? So typically, an Indian person will end up being a victim of a non-Indian person, okay? So a person of another race will actually be victimizing them. Now again, there's going to be historical reasons why that's probably true, sociological reasons why it's true, but why is it that this ends up being a problem? Why would it be that this leads Indian women to believe that nothing will end up being done? And it's actually a pretty simple reason, simple and complex at the same time. That chart is a chart that people, police officers, prosecutors, and so on, use to try to figure out whose jurisdiction crimes in Indian country fall under. And this actually is the simplest possible chart that I could find, okay? A lot of the charts are more complicated than this one, okay? There are so many different laws. There's a thing called the Federal Enclaves Act that you might fall under. There's a thing called the Assimilative Crimes Act that you might fall under. There's the Major Crimes Act and so on. Who's the perpetrator? Who's the victim? Obviously, of course, in this case, it's always Indian country. What kind of crime it is, okay? Certain crimes, that's going to end up affecting whose jurisdiction it is. But the key thing historically is that if the perpetrator of the crime is not an Indian person, then the tribe has no jurisdiction over them. That's the key thing. And of course, in 70% of the crimes that we're talking about, the perpetrator is not going to be an Indian person, which means that the local tribe, the place where the woman lives, has absolutely no jurisdiction to step in, okay? The non-Indian police, the police in the local municipality, a nearby city, or the state police, they could be miles and miles away. And that's just the beginning of the problem, okay? It's actually a lot worse because it is so complicated, and because in the case of violence against women, because frequently prosecution of such crimes is difficult, because again, the women sometimes have a hard time appearing in court. These cases are difficult to try, okay? They're very trying, obviously, for the victim, okay? For all of these reasons, they're difficult to try to begin with, but when it's an Indian country, state prosecutors are liable to just throw up their hands and say, no, we're not even going to touch it. State police liable not even to go out because they're concerned that if they do go out, the prosecution's going to fail. And if they do go out, hey, there could be some kind of a tricky little weird thing in the law that they don't understand that's going to come back and bite them jurisdictionally. So if they go out, they're afraid, hey, they're going to spend all of this time and energy attempting to prosecute a crime, and then the individual is going to go free. So typically, even though the state of Oklahoma actually does have jurisdiction historically over these crimes, they wouldn't send anybody out. So American Indian women effectively had no place to go. That's when it becomes a real social justice issue, okay? An entire class of people who effectively have no place to turn. Now, recently, very recently, this is so cool, there has been a change in the law. There's a thing called the Violence Against Women Act that was passed in 2013. It's actually a reauthorization. The original act goes all the way back to the 90s. But they reauthorize it periodically, and they make some minor modifications to it and so on. And the most recent reauthorization of it actually extends jurisdiction of Indian tribes to non-Indian spouses, so that they actually have the authority now to arrest, to try, to prosecute, and to punish non-Indian spouses who commit violence, okay? That's a huge change, and the thing is that just went into effect. It was reauthorized in 2013, but it just went into effect in 2015, okay? So this actually is brand new. And this is the first time that non-Indian people have been given criminal jurisdiction, Indian people have been given criminal jurisdiction over non-Indian people. Now, the thing is that this issue of jurisdiction actually is a problem in a lot of different areas, okay? Violence against women just happens to be a particularly poignant one, a particularly horrible one, right? But it actually crops up in all sorts of other areas too. There's a thing called the Major Crimes Act, which is a very specific set of laws that apply only to American Indian people on Indian land, okay? So because I happen to be a card-carrying Indian, if I were to go on Indian land and I were to commit certain kinds of crimes, certain kinds of thefts, certain kinds of assault, and so on, all of which we all agree are crimes, all of which we all agree I should be punished for, I would end up being punished under the Major Crimes Act, and a non-Indian person would be punished under the Assimilative Crimes Act and would be punished according to state law. I would be punished by federal law. I would be convicted possibly of a federal felony, a non-Indian person committing precisely the same act might actually only be charged with a state misdemeanor. That is not equal justice under the law. That is not what we grew up believing, right? Certainly not what I believe. Now, The issue that I want to put before you is, why is it the case that there isn't such a thing as Indian jurisdiction? Okay? And I'm going to tell you that in my view, this is just a holdover of a long history, right, of viewing Indians in certain stereotypical ways, in certain ways that frankly we should get rid of. This person here is a good friend of mine, Steve Russell. Steve happens to be a former judge. You can see that Steve was a judge in Travis County. He actually was also a judge in a couple of other jurisdictions. He's assistant professor of criminal law at two different universities, University of Texas System, but also Indiana University, Bloomington, okay? And he did all of that as a citizen of the United States, right? But it also turns out that he's Cherokee. Now, if exactly this same person, if Steve Russell were to be hired by the Cherokee Nation as a judge, as a Cherokee judge, he would be considered incompetent to handle any case involving a white person. And yet, as a citizen of the United States, not a Cherokee, but just a citizen of the United States, he rendered justice and taught criminal justice for many years. Same person, but as a citizen of the United States, he's competent to do it. As an Indian person, he's not considered competent to do it. That is also not the kind of justice that I grew up thinking that America had. And that's part of the reason why I end up using that open door, okay? We can step through that door. The Violence Against Women Act was kind of the first step toward true Indian jurisdiction. I think that if we want to live up to the principles of American justice, the fine principles on which this country was founded, that it's appropriate and only just to allow American Indian people to have the same kind of jurisdiction that all Americans enjoy within their territory. Thank you very much.